This cannot be happening. That house is mine.
The court made its decision. Justice finally caught up with you.
They wanted my house over a few blades of grass. Aurora, our tyrannical HOA president, sued me for $10,000, expecting me to roll over. Instead, I dug into the neighborhood's blueprints, found her dirty little secret, and legally took ownership of her entire estate. Here's how I ruined her. My name is Arthur Pendelton. I'm a retired civil engineer, a widower, and generally a man who just wants to be left alone to drink his morning coffee in peace. 2 years ago, I bought what I thought was my forever home in a picturesque upscale subdivision called Oak Ridge Terrace, located just outside of Bellevue, Washington. Oak Ridge Terrace was the kind of neighborhood that looked like it was pulled straight from a television commercial. The streets were wide and immaculately paved. The mailboxes were uniformly painted, a specific shade of eggshell white, and the lawns were expansive oceans of Kentucky bluegrass. It was quiet, it was safe, and it was entirely controlled by Aurora Carmichael. Aurora was the president of the Oak Ridge Terrace Homeowners Association. She was a woman in her late 50s who drove a pristine white Mercedes SUV, wore designer tracksuits, and treated the neighborhood like her own personal fiefdom. Aurora didn't just enforce the rules, she hunted for infractions. She was known to walk the sidewalks with a literal measuring tape to ensure no blade of grass exceeded the mandated 2.5 inches. For the first 6 months, I stayed off her radar. I kept my head down, paid my exorbitant $400 monthly HOA dues, and waved politely when her white SUV slowly prowled past my driveway. But my peaceful retirement was shattered by something as completely trivial as a summer drought. Washington summers can be unexpectedly brutal, and that July, a severe heat wave rolled through. The county issued a strict watering ban. We were restricted to watering our lawns only once a week for 15 minutes. Unsurprisingly, my pristine Kentucky bluegrass began to yellow, then brown, and finally, it died in large, ugly patches. Being an engineer, I like practical solutions. Rather than waste expensive municipal water fighting a losing battle against nature, I did some research. I decided to overseed my dead lawn with a specialized, drought-resistant micro-clover blend. It's an incredibly eco-friendly ground cover. It stays lush and dark green year-round, requires almost zero watering, never grows taller than 3 inches, meaning I rarely had to mow, and naturally enriches the soil with nitrogen. It looked beautiful, soft, and uniform. To me, it was a triumph of landscaping. To Aurora Carmichael, it was an act of high treason. The first notice appeared taped to my front door on a Tuesday afternoon. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock, bearing the embossed gold seal of the Oak Ridge Terrace HOA. Notice of aesthetic violation, it read, in bold, aggressive lettering. Homeowner at Lot 42 Arthur Pendelton is in direct violation of CC&R. Section 4, Paragraph 2, failure to maintain an approved turfgrass variety. You have 72 hours to remove the unapproved weed infestation clover and replace it with approved Kentucky bluegrass sod. Failure to comply will result in a $50 fine. I actually laughed when I read it. I assumed it was a mistake. I took the notice, walked down the street to the massive, sprawling estate at the corner of the neighborhood Aurora's house, which sat on a heavily wooded, double-sized lot, and rang the bell. Aurora answered the door holding a clipboard. Before I could even introduce myself properly, she looked at my face, looked at the notice in my hand, and narrowed her eyes. "Arthur, isn't it?" she asked, her voice dripping with a kind of forced, saccharine politeness that usually precedes an insult. "Yes, Aurora. Look, I got this notice about my lawn. I think there's a misunderstanding. It's not a weed infestation. It's a cultivated micro-clover. The county issued a watering ban, and this is an eco-friendly alternative that stays green without violating the municipal water restrictions." Aurora smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Oak Ridge Terrace is a premier community, Arthur. We have standards. We do not plant pasture feed in our front yards. You are lowering the property values of everyone around you. It's green and it's neatly trimmed, I countered, trying to keep my temper in check. Half the lawns on my street are dead and brown because of the heat wave. Mine is the only green one left. Brown grass is an act of God, Aurora replied coldly. Clover is a choice, a poor one. You have 72 hours to lay new sod, Arthur. After that, the fines escalate. Have a blessed day. She shut the door in my face. I was furious, but I wasn't going to spend $3,000 to rip out a perfectly good, environmentally friendly lawn just to lay down fragile sod that would immediately die in the heat wave. I ignored the notice. 72 hours later, the second letter arrived. My $50 fine had been applied. 3 days after that, another letter. The fine had jumped to $100. By the end of the month, I was receiving a letter every single week. But Aurora wasn't just citing me for the grass anymore. Once I became a target, she weaponized the entire CC&R rulebook against me. She fined me $75 because my trash cans were brought in at 7:00 p.m. instead of the mandated 6:00 p.m. She fined me $150 because she claimed the trim on my house was fading and no longer matched the approved neighborhood color palette. She even issued a $200 penalty because my garage door was left open for 45 minutes while I was actively cleaning it. I attended the next monthly HOA meeting, held in the lavish neighborhood clubhouse, determined to plead my case to the board. When I stood up during the open forum, the room went dead silent. I am being unfairly targeted, I announced, looking directly at Aurora, who sat at the center of the mahogany conference table. Next to her was David Henshaw, the spineless vice president who acted as her personal lapdog. These fines are retaliatory. My lawn is green, my property is well maintained, and the harassment needs to stop. David cleared his throat nervously and looked at Aurora for permission to speak. She gave him a microscopic nod. Mr. Pendelton, David said weakly, the board has reviewed your file. You are currently in arrears to the association for a total of $850. The CC&Rs clearly state that the architectural committee, which is chaired by Aurora, has final say over all landscaping. You agreed to these terms when you bought the house. I agreed to reasonable community standards, I shot back. I didn't agree to a dictatorship. Aurora leaned forward, steepling her manicured fingers. Arthur, you seem to misunderstand how this works. Oak Ridge Terrace belongs to me. I mean, the association. We are the ultimate authority on what happens outside the walls of your house. If you do not pay your fines and replace your lawn by the end of the week, we will escalate this to legal action. You will be held responsible for all association attorney fees. Don't test me. I have broken much richer men than you. I looked around the room. Several of my neighbors, including a sweet older woman named Sarah Jenkins, were looking down at their laps, entirely terrified of making eye contact with Aurora. No one spoke up. No one defended me. I left the meeting that night with a knot of anxiety in my stomach, but also a burning, white-hot resolve. I wasn't going to let this petty tyrant bully me out of my retirement home. But I had no idea just how far Aurora was willing to go. The escalation happened faster than I could have ever anticipated. After the HOA meeting, Aurora took off the gloves. The administrative harassment turned into outright financial warfare. The problem with many HOAs, and particularly with the CC&R's covenants, conditions, and restrictions written for Oak Ridge Terrace, is that they are heavily stacked in favor of the board. They contained clauses allowing for compounding interest on unpaid fines, administrative review fees, and legal consultation assessments. Because I refused to pay the initial fines for my micro-clover lawn, Aurora began applying late fees. Then, she applied interest on the late fees. Every time she or David Henshaw walked past my house to look at my lawn, they billed my account a $150 site inspection fee. By September, the leaves were starting to turn. My clover lawn was still vibrantly green, and my HOA ledger showed a completely fabricated balance of $4,200. One afternoon, I was in my driveway checking the oil in my car when my neighbor, Sarah Jenkins, hurried over. She looked over her shoulder nervously, as if expecting Aurora's white SUV to materialize out of the fog. "Arthur, you need to be careful," Sarah whispered, clutching her cardigan tightly around her. "You have to just pay her, rip up the lawn, and pay the fines." "I'm not giving that extortionist a dime, Sarah," I said, wiping my hands on a shop towel. "It's a matter of principle." Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with genuine fear. "You don't understand. Principle doesn't matter to Aurora. She did this exact same thing to the Millers 3 years ago. They painted their front door a shade of red that she didn't like. They fought her on principle too. She fined them until they couldn't afford it, put a lien on their house, and threatened to foreclose. They ended up having to sell the house at a massive loss just to escape the legal fees. Aurora's brother-in-law bought the property at a discount. She will ruin you, Arthur." A cold chill ran down my spine, but my stubbornness was stronger than my fear. I thanked Sarah for the warning and went inside. I pulled out my copy of the CC&Rs and read them cover to cover. It was 80 pages of dense, suffocating legalese. It did, unfortunately, outline the board's right to place a lien on a property for unpaid assessments. I decided to write a formal cease and desist letter demanding mediation as outlined in Section 12 of the bylaws. I sent it via certified mail. Aurora's response was swift and merciless. On a rainy Tuesday morning, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, a heavy knock rattled my front door. I opened it to find a bored-looking young man holding a thick manila envelope. "Arthur Pendelton?" he asked. "Yes, you've been served." He shoved the envelope into my chest and walked away. I took the envelope to my kitchen counter, my hands trembling slightly. I tore it open and spread the documents out under the pendant lights. It was a formal civil lawsuit filed in the King County Superior Court. The plaintiff was listed as Oak Ridge Terrace Management, LLC. They were suing me for breach of contract, intentional violation of community covenants, and devaluation of neighborhood property. But it was the final page that made my heart drop into my stomach. Between the compounding fines, the daily site inspection fees, administrative costs, and the exorbitant attorney retainer fees Aurora had tacked onto my account, the HOA was suing me for $10,150.25. Furthermore, the document included a notice of a formal lien placed against my property. The paperwork explicitly stated that if I did not pay the balance in full within 30 days, Oak Ridge Terrace Management, LLC, would petition the court to begin foreclosure proceedings on my home to satisfy the debt. They were literally going to steal my house over a clover lawn. Panic set in, followed immediately by a profound, blinding rage. I realized I was out of my depth. I couldn't fight a lawsuit with common sense and stubbornness. I needed a professional. The next morning, I drove into downtown Seattle to the offices of Thomas Abernathy. Thomas was an old acquaintance, a bulldog of a real estate and property litigation lawyer. He was a cynical, pragmatic man who had spent 30 years fighting property disputes, boundary lines, and HOA overreach. I sat in his mahogany-paneled office and slid the lawsuit across his desk. Thomas put on his reading glasses and scanned the documents, his face impassive. "10 grand, Thomas muttered, flipping to the itemized list of fines. Site inspection fee, aesthetic penalty. Good Lord, Arthur. This woman is treating your house like her own personal ATM. This is aggressive, even for an HOA. Can she do this?" I asked, my voice tight. "Can she actually foreclose on my house?" Thomas sighed and leaned back in his leather chair. Under Washington state law, yes, if an HOA properly records a lien for unpaid assessments, they can initiate a non-judicial foreclosure. It's a brutal tactic, but it's completely legal if the CC&Rs allow for it and the corporation followed the proper procedures. So what do I do? Give her $10,000 and rip up my yard? Not necessarily, Thomas said, a slow, predatory smile creeping onto his face. If there's one thing I've learned in 30 years of suing HOAs, it's that the people who run them are usually power-hungry amateurs. They love making rules, but they absolutely hate following the administrative law required to enforce them. They get sloppy. They miss filings. They exceed their legal authority. Thomas tapped his pen against the lawsuit. You leave this with me, Arthur. I'm going to pull the master deed for Oak Ridge Terrace, the original articles of incorporation, and every piece of paper Aurora Carmichael has ever filed with the Secretary of State. We are going to put her entire organization under a microscope. If she made a mistake, even a clerical one, we'll use it to blow this lawsuit out of the water. I paid Thomas a substantial retainer fee, dipping heavily into my savings. It was a terrifying gamble. If we lost, I would be out the attorney fees, the $10,000 judgment, and, potentially, my home. For a week, I heard nothing. The stress was agonizing. I watched Aurora drive past my house every single day, slowing down just enough to glare at my perfectly manicured, dark green clover lawn, a smug smile plastered across her face. She thought she had won. She thought I was bleeding out, waiting for the inevitable end. On day 8, my phone rang. It was Thomas. Arthur, his voice cracked through the speaker, vibrating with an energy I hadn't heard from him before. How quickly can you get to the King County Records Office? I can be there in 40 minutes, I said, grabbing my coat. Did you find something? Find something, Thomas let out a sharp, genuine laugh. Arthur, I didn't just find a mistake. I found the holy grail of real estate fraud. Aurora Carmichael didn't just step in it. She built a mansion on it. Get down here right now. The King County Records Office was a sterile, brightly lit labyrinth of filing cabinets, microfiche machines, and digital kiosks. The air smelled of old paper and industrial floor cleaner. When I arrived, I found Thomas Abernathy sitting at a large oak table in the back corner, completely surrounded by giant, rolled-up architectural blueprints, plat maps, and stacks of legal documents. He looked like a mad scientist who had just cracked the formula for cold fusion. Sit down, Arthur, Thomas instructed, pulling out a chair for me. He pushed a massive, yellowing piece of parchment toward me. I want to give you a quick lesson in property development. Look at this map. I leaned over. It was the original master plat map for our neighborhood, dated 1996. It showed the winding streets, the cul-de-sacs, and the individual property lines. This is Oak Ridge Terrace, I said. Almost, Thomas corrected, tapping the paper with his pen. This is Oak Ridge Terrace, Phase 1. Look closely at the boundaries. I traced the thick black line denoting the edge of the development. It included my street, the 2 streets adjacent to it, and about 40 houses. But it stopped abruptly at the creek that cut through the middle of our neighborhood. Wait, I said, frowning. Where is the rest of it? Where is the community clubhouse? Where is the 4-acre private park? And where is Aurora's estate? Thomas grinned like a wolf. Exactly. They aren't on this map. Oak Ridge Terrace was originally developed by a company called Apex Builders in 1996. They built Phase 1, your side of the neighborhood. They properly filed the CC&Rs, created the Oak Ridge Terrace Homeowners Association as a registered 501c4 nonprofit, and handed control over to the residents. All completely legal and binding. Thomas pulled out a second map, dated 2001, and unrolled it next to the first one. This one showed the other half of our neighborhood, the clubhouse, the park, and the massive, double-sized corner lot where Aurora Carmichael's sprawling mansion currently sat. In 2001, Apex Builders went bankrupt, Thomas explained. his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The adjacent land was bought by a different developer, Harrison Holdings. They built Phase 2. Now, their intention was to annex Phase 2 into the existing Oak Ridge Terrace HOA. To do that legally, they needed a 2/3 majority vote from the Phase 1 homeowners, and they needed to file an amended declaration of covenants with the county. Did they do it? I asked, my heart beginning to race as I saw where this was going. No, Thomas said flatly. Harrison Holdings went belly up in 2003 before the paperwork was ever finalized. The amendment was drafted, but it was never legally recorded with the King County Clerk. Legally speaking, Phase 1 and Phase 2 are completely separate entities. The Oak Ridge Terrace HOA, the legal nonprofit entity that has jurisdiction over your house, has absolutely zero legal authority over Phase 2. I stared at the map, stunned. But Aurora lives in Phase 2. Her house is right here. I pointed to the massive corner lot on the 2001 map. Bingo, Thomas said. Aurora Carmichael doesn't live in the HOA she claims to be the president of. Her property is entirely unencumbered by the CC and Rs she uses to torture you. She has no legal standing to be on the board, let alone run it. But Arthur, that's not even the best part. It gets so much worse for her. Thomas shoved the maps aside and pulled a thick stack of printed Secretary of State business filings into the center of the table. When I realized Aurora wasn't technically part of the HOA, I started wondering how she got into power in the first place. I dug into the corporate filings for the Oak Ridge Terrace HOA. In 2012, the original nonprofit HOA board dissolved because nobody wanted to run it. The corporation was administratively suspended by the state for failure to file annual reports. So the HOA didn't even exist? I asked. It was essentially dead in the water, Thomas confirmed. Enter Aurora Carmichael. In 2014, she moves into her house in Phase 2. She realizes the neighborhood has no active HOA, and she sees a power vacuum. But instead of legally reinstating the nonprofit 501c4 entity, which would require a vote from the actual homeowners, she did something incredibly stupid and highly illegal. Thomas handed me a document. It was a business formation certificate from the state of Washington. She went to the Secretary of State and registered a brand new private for-profit business, Thomas explained. Read the name at the top. I read it aloud. Oak Ridge Terrace Management, LLC. Right. The exact entity that is currently suing you, Thomas said, leaning in close. Arthur, Aurora has been running a shadow HOA for 12 years. She set up an LLC, of which she is the sole proprietor. She started sending out invoices for monthly dues on official-looking letterhead, and everyone just assumed the HOA had been reactivated. She has been collecting $400 a month from 80 households, nearly $400,000 a year, funneling it into her private LLC, and acting as a dictator without a single shred of legal authority. My mind was reeling. The sheer scale of the fraud was staggering. But what about the community property? The clubhouse? The park? Thomas's eyes gleamed with a dangerous intensity. That is the kill shot, Arthur. When Harrison Holdings went bankrupt in 2003, the deeds to the clubhouse and the 4-acre private park were left in legal limbo. They were supposed to be transferred to the nonprofit HOA, but remember, the paperwork was never filed. So, who holds the title? He pulled out 3 deeds, heavily stamped and notarized. In 2015, Aurora used her fake LLC to file a quiet title action, Thomas said, his voice dripping with disgust. She claimed that Oak Ridge Terrace Management, LLC, was the rightful successor to the developers, and because no one contested it, because no one knew she was doing it, the judge granted it. She legally transferred the title of the multi-million-dollar clubhouse and the 4-acre park to her private LLC. He paused, letting the weight of the revelation sink in before delivering the final blow. But she was greedy, Arthur. She didn't just take the community property. Do you know why Aurora's personal estate is so massive? Why she has a double lot while everyone else is crammed together? I shook my head, breathless. Because her original lot was a standard half-acre, Thomas said, pointing to the 2001 map. But in 2016, she used the LLC to quietly carve out an acre and a half of the community park that backed up to her property. She deeded that land from the LLC directly to herself for $1. She essentially stole $1 million worth of prime real estate from the neighborhood to build her backyard oasis and her massive swimming pool. I sat back in my chair, the fluorescent lights of the records room humming above me. Aurora Carmichael wasn't just an overzealous neighbor who hated Clover. She was a con artist who had defrauded 80 families, embezzled millions in property, and was now trying to steal my home to protect her empire. She sued me, I whispered, looking at the civil complaint I had brought with me. She used the LLC to sue me for the $10,000. Yes, she did, Thomas said, his smile turning downright predatory, which is the greatest mistake she has ever made in her miserable life. If she had just left you alone, she might have gotten away with this for another decade. But by formally suing you through Oak Ridge Terrace Management LLC, she has legally opened the LLC up to the discovery process and counter-litigation. Can we beat the $10,000 lawsuit? I asked. Beat it? Thomas scoffed. Arthur, we are going to annihilate it, but we're not going to stop there. I am drafting a countersuit. We are suing Oak Ridge Terrace Management, LLC, and Aurora Carmichael personally for egregious fraud, extortion, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and invalidation of the deed transfers. Thomas stood up, gathering the massive stacks of evidence. We are going to pierce the corporate veil, Arthur, because she commingled her personal assets with the LLC by deeding that stolen parkland to her own estate. Her personal property is now fair game. By the time I am done with Aurora Carmichael, we are going to win back your 10 grand, dissolve her LLC, and I guarantee you we will seize her entire estate to satisfy the damages. I looked down at the map, my eyes fixing on the massive square that represented Aurora's stolen kingdom. My anxiety was completely gone, replaced by a cold, unstoppable sense of justice. Drop the papers, Thomas, I said. Let's take her house. Serving Aurora Carmichael with the countersuit was a strategic piece of theater. Thomas Abernathy and I planned with absolute precision. We didn't just send a process server to her door. We waited until the first Tuesday of the month, the night of the mandatory Oak Ridge Terrace HOA board meeting. I walked into the opulent, stolen clubhouse just as Aurora was banging her wooden gavel to call the room to order. She was wearing a tailored navy blazer, looking every bit the neighborhood dictator. When she saw me, her lips curled into a sneer. Mr. Pendelton, Aurora announced, her voice echoing over the quiet murmurs of the 30 residents in attendance. If you are here to disrupt this meeting, I will have you removed for trespassing. You are currently in default, and pending litigation prohibits you from participating in association business. I'm not here to participate, Aurora, I said, my voice steady. I'm here to deliver a message. Right on cue, a burly man in a worn leather jacket stepped out from behind me, walked straight up to the mahogany table, and dropped a 2-inch thick binder of legal documents directly onto Aurora's agenda. Aurora Carmichael? The man asked. Yes, she snapped, looking at the binder as if it were a dead rat. You've been served. Aurora's confident sneer faltered as she read the cover page. The color drained from her face, leaving her foundation looking distinctly orange against her pale skin. This meeting is adjourned, she choked out, grabbing the binder and fleeing through the back door of the clubhouse without another word. David Henshaw, her sycophantic vice president, scrambled after her like a lost puppy. For the next 30 days, Thomas and I went to war. The discovery phase of a lawsuit is a brutal, invasive process, and Thomas wielded it like a scalpel. He subpoenaed the bank records of Oak Ridge Terrace Management, LLC. He subpoenaed Aurora's personal bank accounts. He demanded the minutes from the 2014 election that allegedly put her in power. Of course, she couldn't produce the election minutes because an election never happened, but it was the financial records that truly blew the lid off the entire operation. We dragged Aurora into a stark, windowless conference room in downtown Seattle for her sworn deposition. She arrived, flanked by an expensive corporate defense attorney named Gregory Hughes, looking haggard and furious. Thomas started off casually, lulling her into a false sense of security before springing the trap. "Miss Carmichael," Thomas began, pacing slowly around the table, "can you explain to the record what the monthly HOA dues of $400 are used for? Landscaping, road maintenance, clubhouse upkeep, and administrative costs," Aurora recited rigidly. Thomas pulled out a bank statement and slid it across the table. "Interesting. Because I have the ledger for Oak Ridge Terrace Management, LLC from last October. It shows a transfer of $8,000 to a B. Carmichael. 2 days later, your personal bank account shows a debit of $8,200 at a Mercedes-Benz dealership in Bellevue. Did the HOA buy you a new transmission, Aurora?" Gregory Hughes slammed his hand on the table. "Objection. Relevance. It goes directly to the heart of our fraud claim. Counsel." Thomas shot back smoothly. "Your client is running a shadow corporation, collecting dues under the guise of a non-profit and treating the neighborhood's money as her personal slush fund." Thomas didn't stop there. Over the next 4 hours, he meticulously laid out her crimes on the record. He showed how she used administrative fees to pay for her weekly deep tissue massages. He produced the fake quiet title action she used to steal the clubhouse. Then came the final blow. Thomas produced the 2016 deed transfer, the one where Aurora carved an acre and a half out of the neighborhood park and deeded it to her own estate for a single dollar. "Miss Carmichael, did you, acting as the sole proprietor of Oak Ridge Terrace Management, LLC, transfer community property to yourself without a vote of the homeowners?" Aurora was sweating now. Her manicured hands trembled. The park was overgrown. It was a fire hazard. I took it over to maintain it, for the good of the community, by building a private $50,000 saltwater swimming pool on it, Thomas asked, his eyebrows raised. Aurora looked at her lawyer, panicked. Hughes rubbed his temples, realizing he was defending a sinking ship. The deposition ended shortly after. That weekend, I hosted a different kind of neighborhood meeting. I didn't hold it in the clubhouse. I held it in my front yard, right on top of my lush, green, drought-resistant micro-clover lawn. I invited Sarah Jenkins, the Millers, and every other neighbor who had been bled dry by Aurora's extortion. I set up a projector against my garage door and displayed the bank statements, the plat maps, and the fake LLC filings. The reaction was explosive. Men and women who had lived in fear of this woman for a decade were suddenly furious. Sarah Jenkins, who had once warned me to just pay the fines, stood up and shouted that she wanted Aurora in handcuffs. By the end of the night, 80 households signed an agreement to immediately cease all payments to Oak Ridge Terrace Management, LLC, and agreed to testify on my behalf. Aurora's empire of terror was collapsing. The civil trial took place 6 months later in front of Judge Harrison Caldwell, a no-nonsense jurist who had absolutely zero patience for corporate shell games. Aurora's lawyer tried to argue that while her administrative methods were unorthodox, she had maintained the neighborhood's property values. It was a pathetic, paper-thin defense. When it was Thomas's turn, he didn't just present evidence. He dismantled Aurora's life piece by piece. He called David Henshaw to the stand. Realizing he was facing potential accessory charges, David completely flipped. He testified that Aurora explicitly instructed him to target specific neighbors she didn't like, including me, and invent aesthetic violations to drive up the LLC's revenue. But the climax of the trial came when Judge Caldwell reviewed the property deeds. "Let me ensure I am understanding this correctly," Judge Caldwell said, peering over his reading glasses at Aurora, who was visibly shaking at the defense table. "You used an invalid LLC to sue Mr. Pendelton for $10,000 over his lawn. But to build your own private estate, you fraudulently deeded $1 million of community property to yourself?" "Your Honor, I was trying to protect the subdivision," Aurora stammered. "Silence," the judge barked, the sound cracking through the courtroom like a whip. "In my 22 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case of fraud so brazen, so meticulously executed, and so utterly steeped in malicious greed." Judge Caldwell didn't just rule in our favor. He brought down the hammer of God. First, he dismissed the HOA's $10,000 lawsuit against me with extreme prejudice. Second, he ruled that Oak Ridge Terrace Management, LLC, was an illegal, fraudulent entity and ordered its immediate dissolution. He reinstated the original 1,996 nonprofit HOA and ordered the deed to the clubhouse and the remaining parkland returned to the neighborhood. But it was his ruling on my countersuit that made history. Because Aurora had maliciously sued me, intentionally inflicted emotional distress, and utilized extortionate tactics under the guise of an illegal corporation, the judge awarded me $2.5 million in punitive and compensatory damages. Furthermore, because Thomas successfully argued that Aurora had pierced the corporate veil by commingling the neighborhood's money with her own and stealing community land to expand her house, her personal assets were no longer protected. The defendant, Aurora Carmichael, is ordered to pay the plaintiff $2.5 million, Judge Caldwell declared. As the defendant's liquid assets appear to have been squandered on luxury vehicles and personal vacations, I am ordering the immediate seizure and liquidation of her primary residence to satisfy this judgment. The fraudulent 2016 deed expansion is reversed. The original estate will be transferred to satisfy Mr. Pendelton's damages. The gavel dropped. Aurora let out a guttural, hyperventilating sob and collapsed into her chair. She was ruined, bankrupt, and she was losing her house. Because her estate was deeply underwater after she had taken out a massive second mortgage to fund her lavish lifestyle, the court-ordered auction was brief. Through the judgment lien awarded to me, I was the sole creditor with priority. Instead of taking a fraction of the cash from a forced sale, Thomas advised me to execute the lien directly on the property title. 30 days later, 2 King County Sheriff's deputies stood on the expansive front porch of Aurora's pristine, white-painted mansion. I stood on the sidewalk, my hands in my pockets, watching the scene unfold. Aurora Carmichael walked out the front door, carrying 2 designer suitcases. She wasn't wearing her signature tracksuits. She wore a rumpled sweater, her face pale and aged. She walked past me toward a rented moving truck without making eye contact. As her truck drove out of the neighborhood for the last time, Thomas Abernathy walked up beside me and handed me a heavy brass key. "Congratulations, Arthur," Thomas smiled. "You are the proud owner of a 5-bedroom, 6-bathroom estate." I took the key, feeling the cold weight of absolute victory in my palm. I walked up the driveway of my new property, stepped onto the pristine, perfectly manicured Kentucky bluegrass lawn that Aurora had obsessed over for a decade, and dug my heel into the dirt. The first thing I did as the new owner was hire a landscaping crew. We tore up every single blade of that fragile, water-wasting grass. I overseeded the entire double lot with my drought-resistant micro-clover. As for the neighborhood, Oak Ridge Terrace is a paradise now. We held real elections. Sarah Jenkins is the new HOA president, and the monthly dues are a completely reasonable $50, just enough to keep the clubhouse clean and the streetlights on. And nobody cares what color you paint your front door. Aurora tried to take my house over a few blades of grass. I took her kingdom, and the clover has never looked greener. Can you believe the sheer audacity of Aurora trying to steal a home over some eco-friendly clover, only to lose her entire multi-million-dollar mansion in the process. Justice doesn't get any sweeter than that. If you love seeing this HOA tyrant get completely obliterated in court, smash that like button, share this story with anyone who's ever dealt with a nightmare neighbor, and subscribe for more incredible, true revenge stories. See you in the next one.